I woke that evening with the hunger fully upon my mind, and yet the entire castle was as quiet as the crypt I had just vacated. Like an idiot, I had ordered everyone away, and they had gone. There was no one left to slake my infernal thirst. Driven by necessity, I descended from the mountains into Dibbleburg, only to find the village too was vacated, just as I had ordered it to be. My need grew into desperation as I walked the silent streets until I caught the scent wafting on the gentle breeze. Faint at first, but unmistakable. There was yet fresh blood here somewhere. Count Dibbula, sir? I spun around and came face to face with the saddest pair of eyes I have ever witnessed. Before me was a little girl in a ragged dress, shivering in the chill night air, clutching some sort of stuffed doll to her chest, as if it were her only shield against the world. I confess, I am terrible at estimating age, but she couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 winters. I did not know her, but clearly she was aware of who I was, and though I could sense fear within her, it was evidently not fear of me in particular, as she ran to me and clung tightly to my leg before I could even speak. "Where is everyone?" she sobbed as she clung to me. She must have gotten lost during the evacuation. I was overcome with conflicting emotions. When she turned her dirty face up to look at me, I could see the little clean streaks on her cheeks left by the trail of her tears, and my now motionless heart broke for the clear anguish and anxiety she was experiencing. In the next second, an intense anger pushed that compassion aside, and I silently cursed her parents for leaving without her. These emotions were but a flash in my mind, quickly pushed aside by the now overpowering hunger that raged inside of me. I shall do the listener the courtesy of sparing you the details of what happened next, in the hopes that you will not then experience the nightmares I must endure. When the bloodthirst was finally slaked and I finally became aware of what I had done, I let out a cry of anguish that sounded more like a howling wolf than a man, and the hidden wolves in the forest answered with their own howls in a most haunting eulogy to this dear innocent child. I admit to you now that the cry was not for her alone, but also for myself. On the previous night, I had reveled in the new power I now possessed. I was drunk with it. The strength, the speed, the immortality, all these things were intoxicating, but now, looking down upon the remains of this little girl, I came face to face with the dark reality of what I had become. I was no longer a knight in shining armor. I had become a creature of the night, bound to do unspeakable evils until the end of time itself. As I dug a shallow grave for the girl, I learned the most valuable lesson of my afterlife. The stories you tell and the movies you make about my kind usually cast us as solitary creatures, hiding alone in some distant crypt or castle or some other abandoned place, isolating ourselves from you. I'm afraid you are mistaken. We are among you. We live in your cities. We attend your social events. We mix and mingle into your society because we must. We need the living just as the living need water. Without you, we cannot survive. The living are the food that sustains us, and as I placed a few simple rocks to mark this poor child's grave, I was developing a taste for Visobian blood. If they were not invading, I would not have had to send everyone away. I could have fed upon some deserving wretch instead of this innocent child whose face will now haunt me forever, and I vowed to make them pay for it. My immediate necessity was reconnaissance. I needed to know what was happening downriver. Was Count Sebastian on his way, or did the Visobians catch up to him? Soldiers alone should have been able to make the trip in one day, but if he was escorting an entire city full of refugees, the gods only know how fast he could push them. If they were overtaken from behind by the advancing Visobian army, it would be a slaughter. The sound of a short screech in the night gave me an idea. It was widely rumored that my kind could transform into bats. If I could do that now, I could fly over the pass and observe what I needed to see. But how do you transform into one of these winged creatures? I didn't know. I tried everything I could think of, including the absurd. At first, I simply tried to concentrate. I thought if this was some sort of natural ability, then surely there was some way to simply will it to happen. I imagined my legs shrinking down into stubby little claws, my body shrinking down to match. I even began flapping my arms about as if they were wings. It would have been comical if anyone had seen me just then, but alas, it did not work. I was still a man. If there was a way to do it, I simply did not know what it was. I must have looked equally ridiculous when I tried to change into a wolf. Yet another shape it was rumored that we could shift into. I pawed the ground, imagining myself growing fur, and sank to all fours, howling at the moon for good measure. These efforts had the same effect, which is to say, none. I still had the form of a man, only now I looked crazy as well. My howling did draw the attention of the wild wolves, though, and one overly curious fellow padded directly into the town to investigate. That is when I discovered that while I didn't know how to become a wolf, I had no trouble communicating with them. The moment I saw him, I could read his mind as simply as my own. He approached me with curiosity until he saw that I was not a wolf, but a man. These wolves had learned to keep their distance from men over the years. Too many of their kind had been killed by men, and yet I could see the confusion in his mind. I looked like a man, but I didn't smell like one. As I'm sure you're aware, wolves rely heavily upon their sense of smell, and this fellow could not reconcile the conflicting messages his senses revealed to him. He paused, sniffed the air, took a few more steps, sniffed again. He was trying to decide whether the curiosity was worth the risk. I knelt down to his level, extended my open hand, and tried to reassure him with gentle tones. He began to approach again, cautiously, step by step, looking around and sniffing the air for any cause for alarm as he came. Finally, when he sniffed my hand, I reached out to pet him. He lowered his head to accept the affection as though he were any other domesticated dog. I could sense there were others out there, watching, waiting. My mind began to swirl in confusion. I seemed to be watching myself from a dozen different angles all at once. It was chaotic at first, until I realized what was happening. I was looking at myself through their eyes, and if I concentrated, I could focus on a single one. "So," I said, patting this happy fellow a few times, "you are my new eyes. Now, if only I could train you to..." The wolf in front of me looked up and searched my eyes just as I said that. "Aha! So you understand me as well, do you?" He gave me a short bark in answer to my question. To test this theory, I silently asked him to sit, and to my surprise, he did so right away. There was no doubt that he not only understood me, but he obeyed me as though I had been his master all along. I silently bade one of the distant watchers to come, and I watched in amazement through her eyes as she did exactly as I'd asked. Apparently, I couldn't become a wolf, but I could control them. Huh. Well, my friends, it's not exactly what I'd had in mind, but it'll do. The next evening, I awoke to find that Count Sebastian and the townsfolk of Wittich had arrived and discovered the true depth of the problem at hand. He could not count on me to reinforce him. I had nothing left to give, and the only options left to him were bad and worse. He followed my example and ordered the townsfolk to continue on toward Athila, while he and the few soldiers he had would attempt to delay the advancing army as much as they could. It was a suicide mission, and everyone knew it, but what else could he do? With villagers in tow, he could not outrun them, and if they were overtaken on the road, it would be a slaughter. The best he could do was give the townsfolk as much time to get away as he could, and hope that they could reach General Bertal's advancing army before they were overrun by the Visobians. It was all for nothing. Just before daybreak, Visobian cavalry swept down through the Norgrim Pass and smashed through his thin lines of defense. With infantry support behind them to occupy what few troops were left, the cavalry swept through Dibbleburg and cut off the only escape for the fleeing townsfolk. They were forced back to town. As the sky began to lighten, I had to retreat into the darkness again, so I did not see what happened next. But when I awoke the following evening, I made my way down to the village as discreetly as I could. I didn't know what I would find down there, so I didn't want to reveal myself. Besides, the Visobians likely thought I was dead. I saw no need to correct that error. As long as I was dead, they would not bother to look for me. Slipping into town unnoticed wasn't all that difficult. There were guards posted about, but they weren't really watching for outside threats. They knew there was no force within miles of here that could challenge them. Instead, they were mostly focused on watching the townsfolk within. It gave me the feeling of looking in on a prison camp. It was easy to quietly overtake one guard near the outskirts of town to slake my thirst. When I had finished, I tossed his body onto an abandoned wagon and covered him with a tarp. Sure, they would notice him missing eventually, but I thought it best not to raise any alarms too soon. I needed to look around a bit and gather what information I could. I saw several villagers moving about here and there, carrying various bundles and buckets. As I discreetly followed the general flow of traffic, I gathered that the townsfolk had been pressed into service. Some were cooking various meats and other provisions, while others began to distribute these rations among the soldiers. Many of the soldiers mostly ignored the villagers as much as they could, taking food and drink as they approached, but otherwise not acknowledging them at all. A few small pockets were more aggressive than others. Clearly, these clusters had enjoyed a little too much drink and were becoming more belligerent with the villagers, cursing and insulting them, occasionally shoving them a bit to intimidate them. Having spent my life around soldiers, these attitudes were quite familiar to me. When you know tomorrow may be your last day, many men withdraw into themselves to reflect upon their lives and accomplishments. Others try to cover their fear with too much drink and become somewhat belligerent, but harmless blowhards, frequently boasting about themselves or their supposed prowess. But some succumb to the worst parts of the human spirit, doing the things otherwise decent human beings would not. It was one of these sorts that I saw next as I continued to move around the outskirts of the village, gathering as much information as I could. He was posted next to a small house on the edge of town. When a young lady approached, slightly hunched forward, eyes on the ground as she carried a bucket of water toward him, you could see his attitude change. He puffed out his chest, stood up straighter, trying to use his size as intimidation, and looked around to see who else might be near or watching. When she stopped to allow him to get a drink, she did not look at him at all, but as he drank, his eyes never left her. When he replaced the ladle in the bucket, the girl took one step as though to leave, but did not make it any farther. In one quick motion, he grabbed her by the shoulders, covered her mouth, and dragged her into the empty house. It didn't take a soldier's experience to know what was coming next. I circled around the back of the house to avoid anyone else's notice. When I burst through the back door, he already had the struggling girl pinned to the floor with his weight. One hand still covered her mouth as he fumbled to release his belt with the other. My entrance caused them both to freeze for just a moment. As they both stared in my direction, the girl's eyes pleaded for help, and he glared in rage at the interruption. "I don't know who you are, friend, but this is none of your concern. If you value your life, you'll just turn around and close the door on your way out," he threatened. I hadn't yet decided exactly what I was going to do, but quickly an idea formed in my head. I turned slowly and took a step back toward the door. The girl's muffled pleas became a little more urgent as she concluded that I was not going to help her. The soldier obviously had turned his attention back to the girl and whispered, "No one is going to help you, pretty girl." "Nor you," I added with a slight smile, as I slowly closed the door, slid the bolt to secure it, and turned back to face them. I waited patiently as the soldier rose to his feet and drew his dagger. He roughly shoved the girl into a corner so she could not escape. "Very well, you had your chance," he said as he lunged toward me like a raging bull. He was big but slow. Even without my newly heightened reflexes, I could have easily dodged his efforts all night. I simply stepped aside and let his own rush carry him face first into the far wall. The impact stunned him for a moment, and he lost his grip on the dagger that clattered to the floor at my feet. "Not the most graceful fellow, are you?" I taunted as I scooped up the dagger and waited for his next attack. When he charged a second time, I sidestepped again and tripped him as he went by. He tumbled across the floor and came to rest sitting on his rump against the wall. I calmly walked over and knelt down before him with his own dagger held before me. "A bit dense, too, I see," I said as I placed the tip of the dagger to his throat. "Now, my reckless fellow, let's begin our little conversation with an apology to the young lady." "Fuck you," he spat. I didn't really need him to talk. The girl could tell me enough to piece together what I needed to know. "Very well," I replied. "You had your chance." I watched as his eyes grew wide with shock and fear as I slowly slid the dagger into his throat. Seemed like a waste of fresh blood, but it wouldn't serve me well to reveal my nature with the girl sitting right there. If she knew what I was, she'd be quite a bit less likely to help me. I turned my attention to her. Clearly, she was still quite scared as she huddled in the corner, peeking out over the top of her knees drawn up to her chest. "Now, my dear," I said as I extended my hand to help her up, "what is your name?" "Phoebe," she said shakily as she cautiously took my hand and rose to her feet. "Phoebe," I repeated. "I assume you are from Wittich, yes?" "Yes," she answered. "My father is a—" She paused briefly, and as her eyes grew darker, corrected herself. "Was a tailor there." "I'm very sorry to hear that," I offered. "I wasn't, really. Casualties are inevitable in a war, and I had grown quite numb to that by now, but simply dismissing her pain wasn't going to do me any favors in this situation, and I needed an ally right now. While I had my nighttime spies, I needed someone who could watch and listen while the sun was up. "Thank you," she muttered as she indicated the dead man in the corner. "You're welcome," I said as I dismissed him with a wave of my hand. "But I wonder if you might help me in return." "If I can," she offered. I set about asking a variety of questions. Some she could answer, others she could not, but with her help I gained a general picture of what had happened during the daylight hours and the current situation. As I had already seen, the Visobians had cut off any retreat for the refugees and forced them back to Dibbleburg. Their front lines were now drawn up just a few miles southeast of town, while their reserves continued to pour through the pass. Having secured this strategic advantage, they were no longer in such a hurry to advance and had begun to consolidate their forces here. General Bertal and the Athlon forces had made good progress along the Saline River, but were not fast enough to hold the pass. His forces arrayed a few miles further south, he now prepared to fight the Visobians on the open plains. Phoebe could only guess at the numbers of the Visobian troops that had passed through, but if she were even remotely close to their real strength, such a fight would not go well for Attila. I thanked her for the information, and as I opened the door to leave, she seemed to finally realize that she didn't even know my name. "Who are you?" she asked just before I stepped out into the night. "It is better that you do not know," I told her. "Soon enough they will notice him," I said, pointing to the dead man on the floor, "and they will begin to ask questions. The less you know, the less you will have to lie to them, my dear. The less they know, the better for all of us." "Phoebe," I said, turning to look into her eyes, "it is very important that they do not know what happened here tonight. For me, of course, but mostly for you." She nodded agreement, but I went on to make sure she understood. "You saw nothing, you know nothing, you were not here tonight, and this never happened. Do you understand?" She nodded again. "Speak of this to no one, not even the other villagers. If they even suspect you had anything to do with his untimely demise, they will do far worse than this," I said, indicating what had almost happened here tonight. Her solemn nod and slight gulp told me that she did indeed understand. "Now grab your bucket and go, before anyone realizes you were here." As she obeyed, I also walked away, using the darkness and shadows to hide. I made my way out of town and back up to the castle. I needed time to think. Pacing back and forth in my office, I was confronted with the sinking feeling that there was very little I could do. I needed something I simply did not have. I needed an army.